If you feel exhausted all the time, your thinking isn't as clear as it used to be, and your health seems to be slowly declining without a clear explanation, there's one environmental trigger that often gets missed, and that's mold exposure. And the difficult part is that many people live with mold exposure for years without realizing it's slowly affecting their health. Today, I want to explain how mold can affect your energy, your brain function, and your overall health, and some of the hidden symptoms of mold exposure that many people overlook. My name is Dr. Light with Root Cause Resolution and TheoVive Functional Medicine. And on this channel, we talk about the root causes behind chronic symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, gut problems, anxiety, and hormone imbalance. One of the environmental triggers we see surprisingly often in practice is mold exposure. And the reason mold gets missed so often is because the symptoms rarely look like what most people expect. See, when people think about mold, they usually think about allergies or sinus problems. But mold exposure can affect the body in ways that go far beyond just respiratory symptoms. So certain molds produce substances called mycotoxins, and these are toxic compounds that molds release as part of their natural survival process. So the way that I like to kind of think of this is like a skunk, right? A skunk is not so much the problem all the time, but it's what they spray out for them to survive. It's their survival instincts. So they'll spray out this stuff, and that's what stinks, and that's what causes the problem. So oftentimes these mold toxins, it's not the mold itself that's often the problem, but it's the mycotoxins that they secrete. So when people are exposed to these toxins repeatedly, they can begin interfering with several important systems in the body. One of the first systems that tends to be affected is mitochondrial function. The mitochondria are essentially the energy factories inside your cells. They're responsible for producing the energy that powers nearly every process in the body. When these systems become disrupted, the body simply cannot produce energy efficiently. This is why so many people dealing with mold exposure start experiencing persistent fatigue that doesn't improve with sleep. People often describe it as feeling drained throughout the day or waking up in the morning and still feeling exhausted. Another very common symptom of mold exposure is brain fog. So many people begin noticing that their thinking feels slower, or that they may struggle with focus or memory, or even finding the right words in conversation. In some cases, people even describe feeling like they're not as mentally sharp as they used to be. So one reason for this is that mold toxins can trigger inflammation and immune responses that affect the nervous system. So when the brain and the nervous system are under that type of stress, cognitive function can begin to just rapidly decline. And this is one of the reasons brain fog is such a common complaint in individuals dealing with environmental toxin exposure. Another area that mold exposure can affect is the nervous system. Some people begin experiencing increased anxiety or irritability or reduced tolerance for stress. They may feel more emotionally reactive or notice that situations that never used to bother them suddenly feel overwhelming. And this can happen because environmental toxins like mold can influence neurotransmitters and inflammatory pathways in the brain. And for many people, these symptoms develop gradually, which makes it even harder to recognize what the underlying cause is. So mold exposure can also affect other systems in the body, including digestion and hormone balance. So some individuals will develop symptoms such as bloating or food sensitivities or unpredictable digestion. Others experience sleep disturbances, blood sugar swings, or just even feeling wired and exhausted at the same time. The reason for this is that mold toxins can disrupt communication between multiple systems in the body, including the immune system, the endocrine system, and the gut microbiome. So when those systems become dysregulated, symptoms often begin appearing in many different areas of health. One of the biggest challenges with mold illness is that it often goes unrecognized. Many people visit multiple doctors, run standard lab tests, and are told that everything appears normal. But conventional testing is typically designed to diagnose diseases once they're fully developed. Environmental illnesses like mold exposure can create functional problems in the body long before disease appears on lab testing. So another reason that mold illness is confusing is that different people respond to mold exposure very differently. Two individuals living in the same environment may experience completely different systems depending on their immune system, their genetics, and their detox capacity. Many people assume mold exposure only occurs in severely damaged homes, but mold can develop anywhere that there's been moisture or water damage. That might come from past leaks, poorly ventilated bathrooms, basements, HVAC systems, or even previous apartments or workplaces. Sometimes people are no longer living in the environment where the exposure originally occurred, but the body may still be dealing with the inflammatory effects of that past exposure. Another source of mold exposure that many people don't realize exists is foodborne mold toxins. So certain molds naturally grow on crops while they're being stored or transported, especially when there's moisture involved. When these molds grow, they can produce mycotoxins that remain on the food even after processing. So some of the foods that tend to be more susceptible to mold contamination include things like grains, coffee, corn, dried fruits, certain stored foods, and even peanuts and peanut butter. So I want to talk a little bit about peanuts for a second. First of all, peanuts, they're not even a nut. I wouldn't even touch them. They are generally covered. It's called aflatoxin, which is a fungus. It's a mold that is a really potent known carcinogen, meaning a cancer-causing fungus that is all over peanuts. And when we get into a peanut butter, oftentimes it's mixed through and you don't even know that there's mold there. And we tend to way overeat that peanut butter. So peanuts are a really high source. Corn is a really high source. And again, certain grains, we want to make sure that we're getting these from reputable sources that have maybe been third-party tested for molds and mycotoxins. Now, this doesn't mean that these foods are automatically harmful or that everyone eating them is going to develop mold illness. But for individuals who are already sensitive to mold or dealing with environmental exposure, foodborne mycotoxins can sometimes add to the overall toxin burden in the body. So again, think of your toxic load as a bucket. Your body is constantly processing environmental stressors, right? Things like chemicals and toxins, infections, and mold exposure. So if the bucket stays relatively empty, the body can usually handle it without much trouble. But when multiple exposures start filling that bucket, again, mold in the environment, mold toxins in food, chronic stress, poor sleep, etc., eventually the body can reach a tipping point, where symptoms begin to appear. This is one reason functional medicine often looks at total toxic load rather than focusing on a single exposure. Reducing mold exposure in the environment, right, it's usually one of the most important steps. But for some individuals, paying attention to potential sources of dietary mycotoxins can also be helpful while the body is recovering. If you're experiencing symptoms like persistent fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, digestive issues, or chronic inflammation, and you haven't found clear answers, environmental triggers like mold may be worth investigating. One important thing to understand is that detoxing environmental toxins too aggressively can sometimes make symptoms worse. The body often needs support with things like detox pathways, gut health, nervous system regulation before attempting to remove those toxins. So taking a careful and a structured approach is usually the safest and most effective path forward. If you're dealing with low energy, brain fog, or feeling your body just isn't functioning the way it used to, we created a resource that can help you start supporting your energy systems. It's called the Energy Reset Guide. Inside, we walk through some of the foundational strategies that help support energy production, detox pathways, and nervous system balance. You can download it completely free. You can also find it in the link in the description. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe to our channel. On this channel, we break down the root causes behind fatigue, brain fog, gut problems, inflammation, and hormone imbalance that many people struggle to get answers for. Because symptoms aren't random, they're signals. And when you understand what's driving them, you can finally begin moving toward real solutions.